All right, welcome everybody to today's VDEV. We are very happy to have Lucia Corno with us today. We will be presenting a paper on female genital cutting. The paper is co-authored by Iliana Laferrer, who is also with us, and we will be answering questions in the Q&A. Lucia will talk for 45 minutes. After that, we'll have 15 minutes of live Q&A. So at that point, you can raise your hand and we'll have an open discussion. Until then, mics will be muted. So if you have questions, you can write them in the Q&A, and Iliana will answer in writing, or potentially will at some particular points I'll ask some clarification questions. Needless to, the seminar is being recorded for people to have access on YouTube afterwards. And needless to say, no abuse will be tolerated. Without further ado, Lucia, very happy to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Karen. So let me start to share my slides. Okay, great. Let me move this one second. Okay, perfect. Okay, so thank you, Karen, and thank you to all the organizers of this very valuable seminar series to give us the opportunity to present this work. So this is a joint work with Iliana Laferrer at Harvard Kennedy School, and it's part of a much broader research agenda that I'm trying to explore, aimed at investigating potential intervention to mitigate harmful norms. So I would like to start to give you a little bit of background on the role that norms can play in development and why I think it's important to study them. So social norms and traditions are really an important part of life in many developing countries. And economists have long studied their relevance for development. Especially early on, there is a large literature that highlights the benefit of these norms, especially in settings where markets are incomplete or absent. So if you think about, for example, the credit markets, there is a lot of work done on the role of risk-sharing mechanism to cope with this type of markets. However, norms can also have a dark side and be bad norms. So the same type of risk insurance mechanism that might function very well can also generate inefficient behavior. For example, due to excessive pressure for risk sharing and solidarity. So if you think again about the credit markets, there is some evidence that in places where informal networks are present, individuals take out loans to signal that they are credit constrained, even when they hold a substantial amount of savings. And then, norms not only can generate inefficient behaviors, but might be harmful in a strict sense. And these are norms that are particularly detrimental for women. And here we are talking about norms such as food binding, dowry, sex selection, child marriages, female genital cutting, and more recently, norms related to restriction to women employment or, for example, mobility during menstruation because of menstruation taboo. And as such, you can imagine how these type of norms can really be detrimental for economic development and growth. And so an important question is to try to understand whether these culturally entrenched harmful traditions are malleable and whether there is a potential for policy intervention to mitigate them. So in this paper, we focus on one of the most widespread and detrimental gender-based norm, which is female genital cutting. So just to be everyone on the same page, so what is female genital cutting? Is the practice of removing or cutting parts of the female genitalia for non-medical reasons. is generally an initiation ritual for girls between the infancy and puberty, so around the age of 15, and is performed in a non-hospital setting. So unlike male circumcision, which has been proved at least to reduce HIV infection, FGC does not have any medical benefit whatsoever and can generate very serious consequences, both at the time of cutting, such as excessive bleeding, infection that can, in the extreme form can even bring to death of this young girl, but also later on in life. So there might be birth complication for women that have been cut when they were young. And then, given that this is a practice that is performed against young girls, against the will of young girls, can generate even mental health consequences. So despite these consequences, more than 200 million women are cut worldwide, and every year 4 million girls are at risk of FGC. So the practice is really extremely widespread. So in this map, I'm showing you like countries where, in Africa, where the prevalence is common, and the darker countries are countries where the prevalence is higher. So these are, for example, countries such as Somalia, where prevalence is around 90%, Egypt, but also on the East Coast, both on East and West Coast, such as Mali, Guinea, and Sierra Leone. And interesting enough, out of 28 African countries for which we have data, FGC is actually banned in the majority of them. So the only 3 African countries where FGC is still legal are Somalia, Mali, and Sierra Leone. And so this is a settings where the incentive generated by legislation do not match with the incentive generated by formal institution. And then even more, if legislation does not seem to work extremely well to reduce the practice, what can we do to, in terms of policy to try to mitigate FGC? So what we did in this paper was to conduct a large randomized controlled trial in Sierra Leone to test 2 alternative interventions. So the first was an information campaign at the community level on the cost of FGC, for example, in terms of health and in terms of education. The second was a sensitization campaign on the adoption of alternative initiation ritual with the same symbolic value, but without the physical cut. So the idea of this second approach is that in places where FGC is deeply rooted, individuals might also value the cultural and the identity component of the norm even more than the physical cut. And so, thinking about intervention where there is the outright abandon of the norm, but there is like a substitution of the norm with something else that is not harmful, might actually help to transition in a way from FGC. And of course, I will be much more specific in a second on the type of intervention that we exactly run. Okay, so what do we know about norms? So the literature, first of all, tried to understand why these norms are still persist despite the harmful consequences. And one of the hypotheses is what is called misperceived belief about the support of the norms. So the idea here is that I might be individually and privately against the norms, female genital cutting in this case, but I erroneously believe that everyone within the community is actually in favor. And so I'm keeping the norm because I'm afraid of social sanctions. So you might be familiar with the work by Leonardo Bussi and another co-author in Saudi Arabia, speaking exactly in this direction. And recent work on FGC is currently ongoing by Eliana Laferrara, Céline Goulechi, and other co-authors in Somalia, where they are trying to align the belief, private belief with the belief of other community members. Then it might be possible that, you know, people is aware about others' belief, but there is a cost of moving first. So I don't want to be the first moving because there might be social cost. And so these are settings where there are like problem of coordination. So here, the idea is that the norms persist because we need like a high share of families that decide altogether to abandon the norm, okay? And again, Mackie, for example, has a nice paper on how food binding managed to end due to the fact that people overcome this problem of coordination failure. And also there are like NGOs that are now trying to push for, you know, public declaration with the idea, public declaration against cutting, with the idea that if we are able to convince enough people to abandon the practice, then it's possible to move towards a new equilibrium of not cutting. Then there is some literature that just highlight the fact that FGC is the signal of purity and fidelity in the marriage market. So it's like a premarital investment. And finally, you know, some anthropological and sociological literature just mentioned that the norm persists because there is a cultural identity component that is linked to the norm, okay? And so people do not want to abandon because they really believe in their tradition and cultural values. And so what we did in this paper is to focus on this later motive and trying to design an intervention in the context of FGC. What do we know from the empirical side? There has been some papers that have tried to evaluate the role of laws and ban in changing attitudes towards FGC, but we have mixed results. So in some settings, the law against FGC seems to, you know, reduce the attitudes in favor of FGC. In some other contexts, what we observe that in places where when there is like a strong ban against FGC, people tend to reduce the age of cutting, okay? And so banning does not seem always to work in this context, but what happens is that the ritual tend to become even more secret and the age of cutting tend to be lower because it's much more easy to hide an infant that has been cut from, for example, a child who has been cut and who is already going to school. So what we do in this paper is to propose an original, what we think it's original policy tool that we call norm replacement. And also, this is the first paper where we managed to have an objective measure of FGC. So we not only collect data on attitudes, but we measure female genital cutting through health gynecological visits. Okay, so where we work? So we work in Sierra Leone, where the FGC prevalence is around 90% and has been stable across the most recent years. The practice is legal and is costly. So it costs about $20 for a girl to be cut. And FGC is part of an initiation ceremony that in Sierra Leone is called Bondo into secret women's society. So secret women's society are a very powerful institution in all West Africa that act as an informal network of support for women later on in life. So if you are able to go through this initiation ceremony, you are then part of this network of support. And this secret society help girls to make the transition between childhood to womanhood, okay? So the initiation ritual works as follows. Girls are sent to the bush for about 4 weeks, where they are trained on cultural values and traditions, or they're trained on their future role as wife and mothers. They're taught how to sing, how to cook, how to be good wife. And at the end of the ceremony, they are cut. Okay, So this is the setting where we are working on. We were also surprised to observe, looking at baseline data, that there was a lack of knowledge about health consequences of FGC. So in this graph, I show you the fraction of women who declare that there are no consequences of, no health consequences of FGC. So more than 52% actually think that there are no health consequences of FGC. And then we are also in a setting where we didn't find any empirical support for marriage market motives or misperception hypothesis. So when we ask what is the main reason for cutting, no one mentioned, for example, reasons related to the marriage market, such as finding a good husband or be faithful during marriage. And also, we didn't find any support for misperception because there is full support for the norm, okay? So in this context, we believe that there is scope, first of all, for an information component about health cost. So given that the large share of women is not aware about the consequence, we believe that it's important to provide information about the cost of FGC. And second, given that this is really part of the culture of these communities, there might be a scope for a component on an alternative harmless ritual while keeping the tradition. So we really believe that this is important, this community can keep the ritual as it is, so keep the bondo and keep the training on girls and future role as wife and mother, but removing the harmful part, which is the cutting, okay? So given this, we designed an experiment in 2019 where we randomly assigned 150 villages from 3 districts in Sierra Leone to 3 different experimental harms. The first one is what we call T1, where we provide visual information about the correlates of FGC. The second is what we call the bondo, which is the traditional ritual, but without the cutting. So this is our norm replacement harm. And what we did was basically to run community meetings to reframe the initiation ritual in a non-harmful way. So maintaining the training part, but removing the cutting. And then we have our control group of villages. So this is Sierra Leone, these small countries in West Africa. And these are the sample of villages divided by control T1 and T2, where we actually work. So what was the general structure of T1 and T2? So we designed this intervention with a local partner, an NGO called Amazonian Initiative Movement, that is directed by a very charismatic women. And we ran 5 community meetings over 4 months, lasting about 4 hours each. And we tried to involve the whole community in these meetings. So everyone could actually participate, village chiefs, traditional circumcisers that in Sierra Leone languages are called sobis, religion leaders, teacher, and etc., for about 50 participants per village. So I will now go into the detail of T1 and T2. So in T1, the first month, we ran an introductory meeting where we basically set expectation with the community regarding the project, first of all, but then was a first meeting where we start to dialogue regarding FGC and to try to build awareness on the practice. And then in the subsequent months, we provide information on differences in outcomes between cut and uncut girls using VHS data. So in every meetings, we basically show different slides on different outcomes related to health. So we show the probability of having a child who died and the probability of sexually transmitted infection, related to education, related to marriage, domestic violence, and related to income. So this slide is giving you an example of what we the type of information that we provide. So here we have women who have had a child who died during childbirth. And we show that among 50 circumcised women, 17 had a child who died, while among 50 non-circumcised women, only 4 had a child who died. So here, of course, we are showing, so these are correlational graphs. So we didn't, of course, mention any link to causation, but was mainly a starting point for this community to begin a conversation related to potential causes of FGC, okay? And this is a picture of one of our animators showing these slides to one of our community. So what about the bondo without cutting, the T2? So the first meeting is exactly the same as the one that we run in T1. So introductory meeting to build awareness of FGC. And then in the first months, we also run a leadership training. So we work a lot with SOVIS, the traditional circumciser, plus the bondo member in the bondo bush. And here, the leadership training was framed in a way to try to sensitize these SOVIS and bondo members on the idea of running the bondo, but removing the harmful part. So, for example, we mentioned that bondo is more about how you behave and not really so how to behave, so meaning being a good wife and a good mother, but not really on how, not about what you look like physically, okay? Then in the second months, we run focus group to analyze the possibility of taking FGC out of bondo, separately for SOVIS, women and men. And then in the third month, we run joint focus group to discuss the new generation of symbol. And finally, we run a large capacity building workshop to train SOVIS and parents to this new idea of bondo without cutting. So now, and this is a picture of the leadership training. So this is our animator, this is the bondo bush, and these are the SOVIS and the bondo members within the community. So now you might think of, okay, what might be the alternatives to cutting that this community come up with? So given the emphasis on really a bottom-up approach that we wanted to have, and the secret nature of this practice, our local partner prefer not to draft a protocol dictating what alternative sign these communities should adopt. So this should be a process that come up endogenously by each community. But at Endline, we actually ask, let's suppose that a traditional circumciser come to your community and propose alternative to cutting. What do you think would be the best alternative? And what we found is that 40% of women mention a special dress, followed by a public celebration, a training certificate, learning traditional songs, languages, a secret code, or a non-painful sign on the skin, which is like a tattoo. And why this alternative do you think is better? Because there is no physical pain, but also no negative health effect. Okay, so we collect 4 rounds of data collection. We started baseline in 2019. First follow-up 1 year later, and then follow-up 2 in 2021, and Endline in 2022. We run questionnaire to mothers with at least 1 daughter, age 17 to 15, and the sample is pretty similar compared to the DHS characteristics in the same districts. We run these health checks in mobile clinics. During the health checks, we measure height and weight, and then we conduct light visual gynecological inspection to understand whether these girls were cut or not. So of course, participation was voluntary, and we run through a very strict ethical protocol to be able to conduct these health checks. We had the final sample of more than 3,000 mothers and more than 4,000 girls aged 70 to 15. with attrition was around 10% for each rounds of data collection. So we measure FGC through two variables, self-reported by the mothers in the questionnaire, so each mother can report whether the daughter is cut or not, and measured through the health checks by the nurses of our local NGOs. So this is a picture of the mobile clinic where we conduct health checks. Okay, so before jumping into the empirical strategy and the results, I wanted to show you the correlation between the measure of FGC status reported by the mothers and reported by the nurse in the health checks. So here we have as a dependent variable, a dummy equal to 1 if the daughters was cut as reported by the mother. And on the right-hand side, we have a variable equal to 1 if the daughter was cut as observed through the health checks. So reassuring, this correlation is very, very high. And this is not, I mean, this might seem, surprising at the first sight because reporting cutting might be sensitive to these mothers. But remember that we are working in a setting where 90% of mothers are actually cut, and be, member of this secret society is actually a matter of honor. Then these are correlation at baseline. When we look at end line, we still find a very, very strong correlation, which is, again, reassuring. At this point, after that, mothers went through our intervention, they might be, they have been sensitized on the fact that cutting might not be good. But again, we didn't find any statistically significant interaction, even when we look at the interaction between our treatments and our variable of interest. Okay, so let's go to the empirical strategy. So empirical strategy is pretty straightforward. We look at the effect of our two treatments, T1 and T2, on 3 main outcomes at end line, so after 3 years. So what are the outcomes we are looking at? So first of all, as I said, we are looking at daughters' FGC status, both as reported by the mothers or as reported in the health checks. So this is Y3IJ is equal 1 if daughter I in village J is cut. We also look at daughter FGC status plus mother's future plan. So we would like to understand, for example, for those girls who are not cut yet, whether the mothers is anyway planning to cut, okay? So these take into consideration future plan. And then we look at mothers' behavioral outcomes and attitudes. We include a bunch of controls for daughters and for mothers, and we cluster standard error at the village level. Also, keeping in mind that when we look at daughters' FGC status as outcome, we only focus on the sample of uncut girls at baseline, okay? Because, of course, if you are cut at baseline, you cannot be uncut at end line. Okay, let's...
Lucia, sorry, there was a question in the Q&A by David Margolis, who asked whether the gender of the information presenter matters in T1, because in the picture it showed a man, and whether there were any men involved in T2. I think it's useful to clarify for the general audience.
Yes, very good. So, when we run the leadership, so in T1 we have both gender animators, so they can be either males or female. Even in T2, we had both gender when we run focus groups separately for women and for men, but we managed not to include men as animator when we ran the leadership training, because the leadership training was conducted within the Bondo Bush, and in the Bondo Bush, only women who are cut can actually participate. Okay? Okay. So let's go. So before jumping to the main results, let me, so remember that I wanted to show you the first stage. So remember that the goal was to try to reduce cutting through to intervention, new information, and also thinking about alternative ritual. So what we look at here is we look at whether those mothers who were part of the information treatment are more likely to mention health consequences of FGC. And this is indeed the case. So women in T1 are 8.2 percentage point more knowledgeable about FGC health consequences. So meaning that indeed animators did their job very well. And then in column 4 to 6, we look at whether women have ever heard about the bond without cutting ritual, okay? And here, indeed, as expected, we found that women belonging to the T2 group are more likely to have heard about the bond without cutting. I'm gonna always show you the results in 3 ways. So column 1 would be without controls, only discrete fixed effect and a numerator fixed effect. Column 2, I include socioeconomic controls, and column 2, I include both socioeconomic controls and attitude controls, okay? Okay, so let's go in the main results. So here we are look at whether the girl is cut 3 years later, 3 years after our intervention for the T1 and T2 women. So these are, let's look at column 6, which is our most comprehensive specification. So what we found is that girls with mothers in T1 are 25% less likely to be cut compared to the control group. And girls with mother in T2 are 23% less likely to be cut compared to girls with mothers in the control group. So you see from the p-value here showing the statistically significant difference between the 2 treatments that the effect of the 2 treatments is actually very, very similar. So both treatment actually worked in the reduction of cutting. So then we would like to test whether our intervention also worked 1 year before when we look at data at follow-up, okay? And these are the results. So when we look at follow-up results, the coefficients are still negative, so still in the right direction, but we didn't find any statistically significant effect. So the reason for that is that if we look at the mean of the dependent variable in control group at follow-up, so the mean of cutting at follow-up, you see that this is like very low compared to the mean at end line. So only 10% of girls are actually being cut at follow-up. And the reason is that we run follow-up data collection during COVID that led to the suspension of FGC, both in treatment and actually control. And so a potential reason why we didn't find any effect at follow-up is exactly because government banned FGC due to the fact that FGC is generally a ritual where you need to gather together. To test this hypothesis, we look at, for example, we ask questions to mothers such as, do you think that COVID-19 led to less, same, or more cutting? And 92% of women indeed mention less cutting due to COVID. And why less cutting? Because first of all, there was like a harsh economic condition during COVID. And so people had less money to pay for cutting, but also because it was prohibited to have a social gathering. And there is also recent evidence that show that harsh economic condition might delay or reduce cutting. The same in Sierra Leone actually happened with the Ebola outbreak. So then what we did was basically so one of the reasons why girls are not cut might be that they are just too young, okay? Maybe they are not cut because they are too young. And so what we did was basically to consider future plan. So the idea is that in this table, I'm going to show you like as a dependent variable, a dummy equal 1 if the daughter is cut, or if she's not cut, whether the mother is planning to cut hair in the future. Again, we found some effect size at end line for T1 and T2 in the magnitude of about 18 to 15% of the mean in the control group. And also, but it's interesting that when we look in this case at follow-up, we found a statistically significant effect. So although we didn't find an effect on actual cutting at follow-up because cutting was lower due to COVID, we found that mothers are less likely to plan to cut their daughter at follow-up, which is important if we want to think about long-term decisions. Then our results on cutting are supported by other results on other behavioral outcomes and aptitude. Here we look at the effect on donation. So here is a dummy equal to 1, whether women prefer to donate money to NGO fighting against FGC versus NGO fighting against climate change. And here we look at the effect separately, first for any treatment. So this is one regression, and separately for T1 and T2. And we found that treated mothers are more likely to donate to NGO fighting against FGC. And then we also put mothers in an hypothetical situation by asking whether they would prefer to donate lions to family that does not cut their daughters versus a family that would prefer to cut their daughters. And again, we found an effect for our treatment. Okay, so treated mothers are more likely to mention that they would prefer to donate money to households that do not cut their daughters.
Lucia, sorry, there was another clarifying question. When you go to the table with the intentions, because the sample is smaller than the other regression, Elise Villeri was asking why we lose observations.
Here, respect to this one. Yeah, because so here is, so what the reason is that not all the people, the mothers actually mentioned their intention to cut. And so this is why we are losing a little bit of observation related to that. Okay, so we had some missing value for their reported intentions. Okay, so let me go through, let's go through the attitudes results. So here, what we look at are whether we managed to change attitude as well. We look at the effect on feeling about the tradition of FGC, on whether mothers strongly disagree with the statement girls should undergo FGC, and also what was the main reason for not conducting FGC. And here is when they reply, I don't have any good reason for FGC. And again, we found that treated mothers, they have like a much stronger attitudes towards FGC. And especially this seems to be driven a little bit by the T1 treated mothers. In column 4 and 5, we look at whether mothers would support Bondo without cutting over traditional Bondo, and whether they would support the alternative sign. And again, we found that treated mothers are more likely to support Bondo without cutting and alternative sign over FGC. When we pulled through a principal component analysis and create this attitude index, we actually found that mothers in generally treated mothers have developed stronger attitudes towards FGC. One interesting thing I wanted to show you is this one. So when we look at, so here is the sample of mothers who have both cut and uncut daughter at baseline, okay? When we look at mothers who have already cut their daughter at baseline, we still find that these mothers have developed strong attitudes against FGC. So the idea here, which I think it's very important when we think about intergenerational transmission of norms. So these are mothers who have cut their daughter at baseline, And after our intervention, they actually have developed stronger attitudes towards FGC. And I believe this is really important for thinking about future cutting on younger siblings, for example. Then we look at whether our treatment managed to influence social pressure and conformism. So here we ask, would you cut your daughter if everyone, many, half, few, or no one in the community will do? And on the X variable, we report the share of mothers that would cut their daughter if all, many, half, few, and none will do. And the red line is the control group, the blue one is the information, and the green one is the bondo without cutting. So what we observe, so if we focus, let's focus on those mothers who believe that everyone within the community will decide to do cutting. If we focus on this mother, we observe that in T1 and in T2, there is a lower share of mother that would decide to cut, even if all in the community will actually decide to cut, okay? So here, you know, higher the slope, more sensitive people are to what other people think. And so it's important to show that through our intervention, people start to develop strong attitudes towards FGC and be against FGC, even when within a community, everyone will decide to do cutting.
Lucia, there is a question in the chat by Flor Goubert, who asks if the questions on attitudes and intentions to cut have been asked directly or with the LIST experiment. And the question is, they were asked directly, but she wants us to discuss potential experimental demand effect.
Thanks, Flor, for the question. So yeah, we agree. There might be some reporting bias on that. What we check was basically to control for social desirability bias model that we include, but we are of course aware that we cannot make like an extremely good, you know, these are all self-reported. What I can say is that, again, we are working in a context where FGC is actually legal and people is not really afraid to report cutting or having attitudes in favor of cutting, okay? So we believe this problem of self-reporting bias is actually minimal. So what
Sorry, and I misread, it was Sandrine Messon and not Flor Goubert. I apologize.
Sorry. Okay.
And another thing on this is that our results on actual cuts are remarkably consistent in the self-reported and health checks. So if there was strong social desirability bias, we would probably also find it in the cuts results.
Yeah, exactly. So just to summarize, so what we have found so far is that both T1 and T2, so new information and sensitization on alternative ritual, reduce actual cutting, improve attitudes and other behavioral outcomes. So now the point is to try to understand why do treated mothers perform less FGC and whether we are able to find any difference between T1 and T2, okay? So here what we show, we ask mothers for those girls who have not been cut, whether they have attended or plan to attend a bondo without cutting ritual. And what we found here is that those mothers in the bondo without cutting treatment are more likely to actually mention that their girl attend or plan to attend the bondo without cutting ritual. If you see, however, the p-value for the statistically significant difference between T1 and T2 is not significant. And so we cannot rule out anyway that there has been some information seeking from those mothers in T1 that, you know, agree that cut was bad and decided to coordinate to have anyway a bondo or an alternative ritual instead of the standard one. When we ask to mothers, why did you decide not to cut your daughter? we see that the reason for T1 and T2 is actually different. So here in column 4 to 6, we observe, so the main reason for not FGC was, that was mentioned, was not needed anymore to enter in a secret society. So what we observe is that mothers in T2 decided to stop cutting because they believe that this is not needed anymore to enter in the secret society. And this is very important for, it's in line with our idea of the experiment. On the other hand, when we look at the main mentioned reason for not doing FGC is that cutting could cause health issue, we found that the information treatment is more effective. So T1 mothers mentioned that they will not do an FGC because it causes health problems. So these are, of course, qualitative results, but I think they are important to try to understand the mechanism behind the fact that mothers perform less cutting. And then when we look at second order belief, so here we ask mothers whether they believe that all, many, or few or none elderly women support the bondo without cutting, and whether they believe that all, many, half, few, or none among men would support the bondo without cutting. Again, here we found a slightly higher effect for those mothers in the bondo without cutting. So mothers in T1 are more likely to believe that all or many elderly women would support this alternative ritual, and that men would support this alternative ritual. So one potential reason for that is that when you think about this alternative norm, this norm replacement arm, our idea was actually to to think about an intervention that would not generate social consequences in this community. So the elderly women and SOVIs are, of course, paid to run the bondo, so to run the training and to run the cutting. And so thinking about, we would like to think about an alternative that would keep their job going, because we didn't want to have any consequences for these very powerful elderly women in this community. And so we believe that our T2 actually managed to, those mothers in T2 believe that elderly women, given that they would be able to continue their job, would support the bondo without cutting as well. Okay, so then what we did was to run a machine learning heterogeneity analysis following Chernozuko and other co-authors to try to understand who benefited the most by our intervention. And we found that our effect was stronger for women with older daughters. Maybe these, women are those women who have been already exposed to the consequences of cutting because they have older daughters that have been already cut. Those with lower education, maybe for them, they might be less aware about the consequences, or like they might think less about potential alternative of cutting. The effect was stronger also for those mothers who believe that FGC has health consequences, that had health complication after cutting, and that they support less domestic violence. This was measured through an index where we ask the classical question related husband are justified to beat spouse because she's burned the food, and so on and so forth. Where we found heterogeneity, we found that T2 is actually stronger for women that were already less in favor of FGC. For women that were happy if sons marry uncut women, and for Christian women. And these Christian women were at baseline already less in favor of cutting. So it seems like that being less in favor of cutting, so have a strong attitude against cutting, is actually a prerequisite to the acceptance of an alternative ritual, an alternative harmless ritual. So then a last potential question that we thought of was that, you know, we managed to reduce female genital cutting, but FGC might actually be replaced by other means of avoiding promiscuity, and our intervention might have generated unintended effects or backlash. So what we did was basically to test treatment effect on the probability that the daughter is married. So this is a sample of daughter, remember, 7 to 15 at baseline and 9 to 18 at endline. So we didn't find any effect on early marriage for daughter. We didn't find any backlash when we look at daughter pregnancy. If anything, the T1, with the T1, we managed to reduce pregnancy rate, and one of the potential reasons might be that during the information intervention, we also discuss a lot about the importance of education, pregnancy reduction, and later age at marriage. And also when we look at potential mentioned ideal age of marriage, again, here we found an effect, for a positive effect on higher age at marriage for those mothers in T1. So let me conclude, and I'm already, sorry, out of time. So to conclude, we believe that, you know, conventional approach run by government and NGOs often push for the outright abandon of female genital cutting that sometimes might be ineffective. So what we did was to evaluate the impact of a bottom-up approach to mitigate harmful norms, where community reflect on the cost of the norms, the potential harmful consequences, and on alternative norms that preserve the cultural identity of this community, but without harming. And we found that both interventions decreased the probability that girls 7 to 15 were cut by 25 to 23% compared to those mothers in the control group, and their mothers' intention and attitudes to cut 3 years later. But it seems that women reduced cutting for different reasons. And there might be, you know, scenarios where one approach, new information versus alternative ritual, might be preferable to each other. For example, we found through our heterogeneity analysis that T2 is actually preferable in places where people are against FGC, but still do it because of social pressure. And so in these cases, you need to propose an alternative to cutting that is not, that might be adopted by the community by keeping the identity. And our, as I said before, our goal of when we designed T2 was really to try to reduce cutting without creating general social consequences. So with T2, women can be still part of the secret society that is a network of support for them later on in life. And also traditional circumcision can have, like, again, their job without consequences of general equilibrium. So we believe that our results call for more research on locally generated solution to the eradication of harmful norms. And I will stop here and looking forward to receiving your question.
Thank you, Lucia. So if anybody wants to ask questions, please raise your hand so we can open the mic. And Gianmarco, go ahead.
Super interesting. One question: do you have data on whether older daughters or sisters learn about the harmful effects of genital cutting? Because what I'm thinking is that if you're thinking about long-term cost effectiveness, perhaps in the long term, unless the information is passed across generations, or everyone in the community learns about it, the effects are going to disappear in the future unless you run another information campaign, right? So that would make the case for long-term cost effectiveness of the bundle without cutting.
Yeah. So we actually do not have data on attitudes of older daughters because we only interview mothers. And so this is what we have. And so the exercise that we have done in this direction is exactly try to understand whether the attitudes of mothers changed even for those mothers who decided to cut their daughters at baseline. So I think this is the best we can do. We can also look at self-reported cutting of younger siblings. This is going to be self-reported by the mothers only, but we didn't interview older daughters. And so we don't know whether attitudes of these daughters in principle changed over time, unfortunately. Yeah.
So there is a question by Suzanne Belou. You can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you very much. Do you hear me well?
Yes, I can hear you well.
Thank you for the presentation, super interesting. I was wondering whether you had an intuition of why, such harmful norms that are painful and everything continue to be here, and why those alternative solutions do not emerge at all. Why is that so sticky? I don't know. Yeah.
So again, there might be many explanations for that. One of the potential explanation that we try to address in this paper is exactly this idea that there is a cultural component linked to the norm. So people reply that they continue to do cutting because this is really part of their culture. And it's true. I mean, that's the, the number one question, but it's very true that these norms are actually pretty sticky over time. I didn't manage to show you this graph because of in the interest of our time, but what we observe here is that basically when we look at development captured by primary and secondary education, we observe that in many countries in Africa, primary and secondary education actually increase, and these are the red lines. But when we look at female genital cutting, it seems to be pretty stable across the years. And so, yeah, there might be many potential reasons I mentioned, such as misperception, coordination failure, but we believe that the cultural component is really very, very strong, and people do not want to abandon their identity. So this is why we designed this experiment along this line.
Well, there's no other question. Let me take advantage of your conclusion slide. So and going back to what Jean-Marc was saying, one of the striking results I thought is that, you do the information intervention relatively early, you don't see much during COVID, and then you do have an impact of the information intervention, a number of years later, which suggests persistence of the information. And so I wonder whether you have, given that and given the similarity of the results, I wonder whether you have an intuition of which one of the two approaches is more scalable. I mean, I understand T2 is the more original one, but is it the more scalable one too?
Yeah. So we also believe that T2 is more scalable in this context because, again, we should have probably, I mean, to answer to this question, we should have run another round of data collection that at this point we are not sure we would like to do. But it's more scalable because we believe that can generate less potential backlash for the community. So I think one reflection that we are doing nowadays on this paper is really to understand what happened to those mothers that received the information, T1, because there is some evidence that some of them actually declare to have attended the bondo without cutting ritual. Some other don't. So they might be just scared about the potential consequence and so decided to stop. But if they stop, probably they will not part of the secret society anymore. And so there might be, you know, a backlash from the fact that they don't have they might give up to the network of support later on in life. And so with the T2, our idea was really to try to propose an intervention that is sustainable over time for this type of community where identity is important, and when a huge, a consistent part of women actually work in the bondo bush as trainers and cutters. So this is the intuition that we have behind this result.
Thank you. And so in the process, there is a question that got asked, but Francisca, we are out of time, so I'm going to suggest that you join Lucia in the Zoom room that got posted there. Lucia, thank you so much. This was super fascinating. Iliana, thanks for being with us also and answering the questions. And we are sorry, there was one more. I think Martine had another point, but we will have one more VDEV this year, at least one more with Orazio Atanasio in 2 weeks.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Karen. Thank you all, and thanks for the comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye. I will open.
Thank you, Lucia, for interesting presentation.
Thanks, Martina. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.